I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And I have to tell you that I'm wildly in love with I Will Greet the Sun Again. And I know you guys have heard me say this on the show before, but Justin Torres, We the Animals, also a fan. This book may remind you a little bit of We the Animals. Mega Majumdar, also a fan. Javier Zamora, the author of Salido, also a fan. Caleb Azuma Nelson, also a fan. So I'm not alone in my love for Khashayar Khabushani's debut novel, I Will Greet the Sun Again. And I got to tell you, dude, for a guy from the 818, you have written the quintessential LA novel. And there are going to be some people who are just like, what are you talking about? But I'm going to ask you to introduce the book and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Miwa. The way I've been describing this book is it's a very quiet book. It deals with big themes of home, of diaspora, of trauma. But to your point, it takes place in the Valley, which is in Los Angeles, and in particular, it takes place in Canoga Park, which is one of the many neighborhoods in the San Fernando Valley. And the way I've been thinking about this book, because it also speaks to my experiences growing up in the Valley, which is that there is everything that happens, and yet there is nothing for the narrator, seemingly nothing that is happening. Long days, scorching sun, dry heat. I think that's even a line from the book. We're doing nothing at all, and yet everything is happening in our lives. So for readers, if they're interested in that, I would say please do read if you're interested in having everything that happens and nothing at all.
But it's really important because these are kids who are living life in translation as well. Life is not easy for their parents. And I'm not just Kay's. Kay is one of three brothers, Sean and Justin and Kay. We're going to get to Kay in a second. But, their parents are really trying to make the American dream work. And then there's Johnny, whose parents have a complicated story. And then there's Christian. All of these kids have parents with complicated lives. And one of the things I love about what Javier said about your novel is that it's for all of the kids who grew up in apartments, who had to make their own breakfast and lunch and dinner. So you're writing about class. You're writing about privilege. You're writing about basketball too, which you can't be
from LA, Miwa.
Write about basketball.
You said it. You said it.
We have to talk about basketball. But here are all of these boys coming of age in very different ways in the 1990s. And I got to ask why you chose the 90s, because you, my friend, were not around for much of the 90s. You were a toddler for much of the 90s.
Although I will say, and maybe there's like some neurologist or whatever psychiatrist that will dispute, but my first memory, very vivid, is when I was 2, which was the Northridge earthquake, which was devastating. Wow. So that would have been 94. And I think in a way, that's what I was like, I do remember. And so if, I'm like, well, let me set that in that time where, and kind of bump up Kay's age where he would be sort of quote unquote coming of age in the early 90s. And, and just a more like boring note, I think I was alive for the transition of not just social media, but like obviously, the iPhone when that would have been 2007, it really changed everything. And I wanted to set a story pre all of that when you had to like call your buddy, be like, the bus is going to drop me off at 3:15 at the KFC, and there's something like really, to me, romantic about that. Didn't feel very romantic at the time, but now looking back, it feels very romantic.
There was much more serendipity to it. There was much more chance of getting lost.
Yes.
And finding something that you weren't planning on finding. And sometimes that included you, right? Like, I love these brothers. I love Sean. I love Justin. I love Kay. And I am delighted that they are not my brothers, because I think I would not have survived like 50. They are boys, man.
If you're happy they're your brothers, be happy they're not your sons. Like when I look at my mom and what she like, damn, woman, you did it. Put yourself through school. Like, oh my God.
Yep. But I love these guys. And they are, Sean is the basketball player who's a little too short to play college ball, but he ends up like making space for himself. Justin has an arc that is wholly his. And we may touch on it a little bit, but I feel like his journey ends in a little bit of a spoiler. So we're going to dance around that a little bit. But Justin, he's kind of who I expected him to be for a middle child. Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but it kind of makes sense. And then Kay, who's our guy, he's our guide through this whole thing, this kid. And part of what I'm wondering is when the book started for you, because you are a very physical writer. And by that, I mean, there's a scene where the boys are taken to the beach by their parents and like just the immediacy of it, and little boys playing at the beach and being free of the valley and all of this other stuff. I mean, many people think immediately of the beach when they think of Los Angeles, and that's not a lot of people's experience of this.
Thank you for saying that, because I think even for me, there's like when we hear Los Angeles, to your point, we think Malibu, we think ocean, and then of course we think Hollywood. Part of the valley that I grew up in, you might as well have been taking a family trip to a different state, a different city when you were able to go to the beach. It was a very novel experience, both for me and of course for the characters. So I appreciate you pointing to that, because I think to this very day, I'm still trying to understand, like anytime I'm back in Los Angeles, what my relationship with that place is and what it means to me, what I have access to, what I don't have access to.
I think, too, it's really hard for people who aren't from LA, certainly, to understand sort of the scope of the valley, right? Like, it's much more than the Galleria. Okay, like straight up. It's not just that mall from that Moon Unit Zappa song. One of the largest Chinese American populations, actually, Monterey Park, man, like that is like the biggest suburban Chinatown there is, and it's really well established. And there's a whole Armenian community, and there's I mean, there's so much in the valley. And yet oftentimes I think of sort of this washed out 70s image, right? Where everything's dry and brown and, swimming pools are empty and kids are skating in them. Like that's what I think of when I think of the valley. And it's so much more complex in so many ways. So when I saw that you had set your novel there, I was like, okay, I'll follow you. I will, because I mean, there is a very large Iranian American population, sort of more towards Beverly Hills and Beverly adjacent, all of that Beverly Hills adjacency.
Well, and you're bringing up a good point, because there are all these identities and sub-identities in Los Angeles, but also for Kay and this family. And you highlight yet another one, which is, I remember when I would tell others and maybe even adults, like, yeah, I'm Iranian, I live in the valley. They're like, oh, great, you have a robust community. What you're pointing to, especially on the west side in Beverly, it's the Iranian Jewish community. We're Muslim, and I always longed to be a part of it. And but for political and class reasons, it just wasn't quite an option. And there's always a kind of a heartbreak for me. The Iranian Muslim community is present in Los Angeles, but much smaller in comparison to the Iranian Jewish community.
Part of what you're doing too, though, you bounce into Iran actually in the 90s.
Can't believe they let me do that, Miwa. I was like, I was so excited to put a boy in Iran.
Dude, it's so good. I mean, honestly, some terrible things happen, and I'm not making light of that. But like the fact that you have a full quarter of this book, and when I realized what Kay's dad was doing by taking the boy, I was just like, wait, how? But it's pre 9/11. Flying was a totally different thing. He's dad. He's got their passports.
You bring up such a good point, and that goes back to your question too of like why set it in that era. Because I remember kind of telling this, you go through therapy, you do therapy through up to your eyeballs, blah blah blah. And I remember my therapist mentioning like, there's no way a father, like today, I guess the mother has to be at least on the American side, mother has to be present. Back then, it's just like, nope, this is what I'm doing.
There's paperwork. There's paperwork now, whereas before, I mean, I remember my parents taking us to the airport in Boston so we could watch planes take off and land. We were easily entertained children. We weren't allowed to watch television. So, I mean, is it any wonder that I ended up a bookseller? But I still, and I'm one of those people who still lives to fly, even though flying is not, it's just not what it used to be. But I quite enjoy being on the plane, and I have no problems entertaining myself. So if the Wi-Fi goes down on the plane, I'm okay. Like, I'm good. But this idea, too, of this sort of freedom that these kids have, because even though their parents are doing the best they can. Let's say parents are doing the best they can. These boys have an incredible amount of freedom. And I think kids today don't have that freedom of movement the way you or I would have, in an earlier age, as it were. And I think that's really important to stress because these boys are figuring out how to be boys. Like they really kind of don't get their mom. They love her, but they don't get her. They super don't get her.
I don't think she gets fully in this instance because, here's somebody that has left her country, is married to someone much older than her, is living in a foreign land. And I think in some ways, at least in this part, like, I don't think she fully gets what's happening. There's a lot of, this isn't language that Kay uses in the book, but I think as sort of somebody reading it, it's like, oh, there's a lot of dissociation happening, and rightfully so. She's got as much, on her plate as the boys do. So yeah, I think all of them are trying to sort of, there's just like a lot of experimentation. And I don't mean to use that word lightly. I mean that like in a very profound sense of let's find ourselves, whatever that may look like or whatever that may mean.
And each of the brothers really do. And that, like, they each have an arc. And I appreciate that because no one sort of gets, especially when you've got three characters who are so different, who are so full of life, who have very different journeys in the same family, right? Like, we should never assume that siblings have the same experience of a family.
Well, you bring up such a good point. I know many people can relate to this who have siblings. Like, it's so astounding to me, three boys, three girls, or mixture of siblings, whatever, grow up in the same household. And then 20 years later, they all recount what happened in that house very differently.
Yeah.
Even though they were went through the same things, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, sometimes when I look back at this story and I look at Kay, I wonder, I was like, it's this kind of, I know it's really bizarre. I feel this like reverse shame for giving the brothers and maybe even other characters like their own arc. Cause I know like technically like in a first person coming of age novel, like it's about that narrator, that protagonist's journey, but I just love them so much. These characters, I couldn't help but like be equally invested in them as I am in Kay.
Yeah, and I'm going to poke at you. Shame is a really interesting word choice. And I'm going to poke at you for a second because why not just write the thing you wanted to read, right? Like, that is a very fundamental piece of advice that writers who are just starting out get from a lot of different, famously Toni Morrison, right? I wrote the novel I wanted to read. Like, this is just such an LA book in so many ways. Like the sort of slightly feral children, the relentless heat. God, I think it was Henry Hoke who just said this the other day on the show, that he felt like he didn't have a center when he moved to LA. And LA is one of those places where you need to have a center. And like, clearly the Valley is your center. Like K-Town is my center. But I live in a very specific piece of K-Town that abuts a lot of different other communities. And that to me is LA, right? Like the cacophony of the language and, what I see in my Vons and, all of that stuff and how
you need that
the landscape changes, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. I know there's that adage, like if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. I think if you can make it in LA, you can make it anywhere. Because to Henry Hoke's point, like if you're not really diligent about, I'm sorry to use the canned phrase, but like establishing community, you're absolutely screwed. Whereas in New York, there's like because it's so compact and you don't need a car, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot more opportunity to, even if you're not even engaging with people in a very substantial way, for me, at least in my time there, just seeing people, being around bodies constantly, there's a lot of work that does for you, especially if that's something that's really important to you.
So I want to talk about craft for a second, because this is your first novel. It is very assured. And you also give Justin, the middle brother, Justin, a line that he says to Kay, his little brother. It's a little bit further on in the book. And he says, you have to fall in love with the thing that's been right in front of you. And I sort of feel like that's your relationship with writing, that this has always been there, but you took a minute. You were teaching before you went and got your MFA. And then it was Heidi Julavitz, who was one of your professors at Columbia, who was like, well, actually, you can use fiction to tell the truth. You don't have to write nonfiction to be able to tell the truth. And I want to take all of those points and start talking about how you became a novelist, because clearly there's a lot that went into this book. I mean, you're wrestling with lots of big ideas and big themes and characters that some of whom we're going to love and some we would like to punch in the throat. But I want to talk about you as the creator of this world and these characters and how we got here, because, I mean, you're not the first person to have taken a little bit of a detour before an MFA program.
Yeah, when you invoke Heidi Juliff's name, I get so emotional about that, because I had many professors in the MFA that were so instrumental and generous, but and it was also very serendipitous that I took a class with Heidi Juliff, because she teaches in fiction. I was a nonfiction student, but it just so happened there was availability, and I applied and got accepted to her workshop, and getting to see it, there's what she said about the ability that what fiction can do, and something else that she told me that always stuck with me throughout this writing process was allow your narrator to go where he wants to go, and your job as a writer is to stay out of the way of that. Because I had my idea of, because this novel is so autobiographical and so many of the things I experienced, I had an idea of how I wanted the story to unravel. But one of the most meaningful things about writing this book is I had the chance to recreate the past and sort of envision what life for me could have been like had some very significant things gone differently. And that's where, I guess, from the craft level, like, that's what brought me to fiction, to the novel. And to your point about the detours, is like, I was somebody that was like getting kicked out of class as a young person. I was even in middle school asked to not return at a certain point because I kept getting into trouble. And there was no world where I would become a writer, at least the way I felt it. And yet, to your point, I was always, even if I wasn't writing, I was always narrating what was happening. And I don't know if that's a coping mechanism for a young person, or maybe that's something that a lot of people who go through trauma can relate to. But once I realized that there's been this voice all along that's been soothing and helping me, I wanted to see if it was possible to bring that to the page.
Yeah, and what you just told me is you were telling yourself stories.
I was telling myself stories. I was the first audience.
That's what that is. Whatever device you want to call that, right? Like, that's you telling stories. That's what stories do. Okay, it's a novel about LA where you know who I'm about to invoke. Joan Didion, we tell ourselves stories to live. Like, there is a reason that line has been tattooed on the back of so many brains, right? Not all Angelinos, but at the same time, like, yeah, you do what you need to. And if story is the thing that helps you through, like, I cannot begin to imagine how difficult it was to be Muslim in America after 9/11. Like, it was chaotic. I mean, I remember hearing the stories, and I was certainly, I was an adult, so I remember so much more than I might have otherwise had I still been in school and whatnot. But it was gruesome to see. It was gruesome to hear, and people were so cavalier about it.
Well, and now that I look at it back as like an adult and have all the language that we now are afforded, and I certainly do not want to dismiss the gravity of that, but to kind of speak to the novel and to speak to, because I was such a young person when 9/11 happened. To me, to this day, what I still am grappling with and can't get over is it was actually amongst loved ones. And so Andres and Danny and Marcus and Lisette, like, we were so tight. And then I think it was Wednesday, post 9/11, I go from being best friend to being Osama, like that. So it came from the young people too, which we pick it up at home, of course, right? But I think we're supposed to be better than everybody else, was like my idea, but clearly not.
It was a wild, wild moment in American history. And the kind of thing too, like I actually will never forget the smell. That's the thing that I still like, not often, but like when it pops, you're just like, oh, right. Like when the wildfire smoke was coming down from Canada, it was like, oh yeah. It's really kind of trippy to have that sense of place. And I mean, yeah, you grew up in the Valley, but you do capture a lot of the culture. And not just the I know I keep coming back to the basketball stuff, but you've got parents with an arranged marriage. You've got parents who have struggled in the United States. You've got parents who can't translate themselves for their children. You've got a kid, Kay, who takes away his own name. He's like, yeah, just call me Kay. I don't. My dad named me after a Persian king, and no one can say my name. And I'm just going to take my own name away.
But you think about like how violent that is for a person, Miwa, to like for a young person to how disorienting to never have, even before they have a chance to introduce themselves or be introduced to the world as who they are. I mean, names are so primal and important and can be complicated, of course, but to be severed. And I think that's just one aspect that Kay is contending with. But of course, like, you take the elevator up, it starts with his father, who's like also severed himself from so many parts of his past and his identity. And so nobody really stands a chance in this kind of mixture. And one thing that I feel kind of really encouraged by is hearing people talk about how it's a very hopeful book. Because as I was writing it and as I think about it, like, and I guess that goes again to your point about fiction is I don't feel very hopeful about these things, and I'm still contending with them, the sort of aftermath in my personal life. But to kind of re-envision something and to make it more hopeful, I think for me was like, I guess my life depended on that. Like I needed to have that aspect.
I would have followed you wherever the book was going to go, like straight up. I was just going to like, I was in it. You delivered a really hopeful ending in a lot of ways. And, you know I've hinted at Justin's arc, and I'm hoping he's okay. But that said, it's still, for him, it's hopeful. Sean gets a really hopeful arc. And Kay does his thing. It is kind of an open-ended bit, and I'm wondering if you're going to come back to Kay. I sort of feel like you're not done with him.
What do you think, Mila? You think I should?
I would obviously read more. I do feel like there's space, and I feel like there's space for all of the brothers, because Sean gives you a chance to hit, a whole different LA. Justin gives you a whole different America, possibly.
And who we haven't talked about is Khaled, is the aunt, who's like plays a big role in the boy's life, getting them back to their mother. I'm also like, she won't let me go, because there's a lot about her life that she tells Kay, but it's not explicitly told about her life. And I'm just like, where did you find your courage? Like, especially as a woman in Iran, like post, revolution, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I'm sort of, in the best way a writer hopes for, I'm sort of still haunted to answer your question, is like, I'm still haunted by these arcs and these characters and these voices.
I think there's so much more here. Yes, I do want to hear more about the boys' auntie, but I'm really attached to the boys. And I'm really attached to them figuring out, I mean, I suppose there's some familiar elements to an immigrant story here, right? Like, there are some details that are shared no matter what, but these boys are so alive on the page. And they're so vibrant, and they're so themselves. And I mean, they also beat each other up like little boys do, but there's something for the path of each of them. And so I'm voting for maybe more about them. But I want to talk about literary influences for a second, because here you are, you've had some great teachers without a doubt. Clearly, you've been reading around as much as you could. And that's part of being an MFA student, but it's also just part of being a person, right? Like part of how you learn to write is by reading a lot. So let's talk about literary influences. Let's talk about some of the writers who also helped make you who you are.
I joke that I'm a closeted poet. I will never even have, I don't think in this lifetime, but the gumption or the guts to sit and say I'm going to compose, a line of verse. I don't understand how we are so fortunate to have poets in our lives. Or I was just listening, so I have Christina Sharp's Ordinary
I love
Notes.
that book. Ordinary Notes is insanely great. That book is so special.
So the concision, but it and I know it's not, a book of poems, but this ability to sit and as economically as possible, pack a lifetime of feelings and thoughts within a few lines. And that to me, so Christina Sharp, and I'm looking at my book stack here, and I often turn to poets, so Kaveh Akbar, love W.S. Merwin. I recently read Huasu's Stay True, which I also loved. And it's hard to sort of say this person or that person is a literary influence because I'm such a whore for language. I just need it. Not because it brings me pleasure, because literally I don't stand a chance. I didn't stand a chance as a young writer to do this thing. I had people show me this is the way it's done. And so I'm constantly borrowing from them, learning from them. And I'm always opening up a new book and seeing where it'll take me.
I think being able to pull any work apart at the sentence level is impossibly important. And I think I get really picky about language. I get really picky. Honestly, I'm okay if nothing happens as long as the language is there. I don't actually need stuff to happen. I really just, if the language isn't there. And I know other people who are like, well, if stuff doesn't happen, why am I reading? I'm like, well, there is a book for everyone. There genuinely is a book for everyone. I'm just telling you where I come from and sort of I need to be pulled in to a writer's POV. And that starts with language for me. And that language and voice are inseparable. I think there are some people who would like to sort of take a X-Acto knife to that. And I don't think you can. I think every choice a writer makes is ultimately about voice, about point of view.
So you're okay, if the language is doing what you need and want language to do, you're okay with the absence of plot?
Yes, I am, but I'm rare. I am rare in that. Yeah. And there are times where I will pick up something and put it down and pick it up and put it down. I just, more than most, I will stick with it. What I always need, though, is voice. Yeah, so I guess I am saying no, I'm okay. I'm really okay. As long as the language is there, I'm really okay.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm right there with you. And you're right. Sometimes that means if it's not a plot driven book here, and you're not I have to know what happens next. But it's what I love is you can read a few pages, satiate yourself, and then come back to it. And it's more so the slow burn, which is my favorite reading as well.
So dialogue also for me, the way your characters talk is really important. I feel like I have a
Isn't dialogue so embarrassing? It's so hard.
Yes, it's hard, and it should be hard. But the thing is that you just got to read a lot of playwrights. That's really what it comes down. Just read a lot of playwrights, and then suddenly it all makes sense. And that's the only way to explain. That's the only way to explain dialogue. It's just just read a lot of playwrights because that's all dialogue. It's all dialogue.
That's so good. I paid $1 million for my MFA and I never got that advice. Now I got it from Miwa.
Sorry, I think I may have stolen that from someone who did get an MFA, but then went to law school afterwards. Long story. I was just okay. I'm just going to go be a bookseller. Thanks very much. You keep doing the school. I'm just going to go be a bookseller and talk about cool stuff with interesting people. But the idea that you were that kid who was bouncing in his chair and did not like school and did not want to be there. I mean, I think that says so much more about the environment than it does about the kid. And I think it's really easy to lose sight of that. And you taught for a while, right? What ages were you teaching before you went
I taught middle school, and I taught in Pacoima, and I was just talking to a friend whom I taught with and still works as an educator, and I was telling her, I was like, I feel like I was one of the students. You know, I did my best to teach and show up, and was a very good teacher. She's like, oh, you definitely were like that. The things that those kids were going through, and what you've been like. She's like, I didn't see much of a difference, and so for me that was really meaningful. And I want to say this, Miwa, because it's so important in regards to teaching, and it's something that I've shared and that I continue will, which is like my most important writing instructors were my students in Pacoima, and specifically the reason that is at the end of the year they had this assignment where in order to also work on writing and sort of practice gratitude, there was this sort of cool merging where at the end of the year, they were asked to write gratitude letters for the teachers and the leader of the director of the school, et cetera, et cetera. And at that point, I was, we talked about reading, and I was turning to writers who have been sort of critically acclaimed, and et cetera, but use very sophisticated syntax and diction and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm reading these gratitude letters from my students who, 12, 13, 14 years old, but because of environment and circumstances, a lot of them, their reading level and writing level is at the second grade or third grade level. But what I'll tell you is, as I was sitting there reading these gratitude letters, because they had the willingness to write in their own voice and to use the language that they have, I could see and hear each of them so clearly as I was reading these letters. And I thought, that's what I want to be able to do. To your point, to me, the most important thing when you read, whether it's a letter, whether it's a novel or poem, is to like be able to see that voice fly off the page. And it was because of my students where I thought, I'm going to really lean into that. And so in the novel, I think I know it's told, through a young person POV, but that's why I tried to keep the diction really stripped down, and to allow that voice to really come through.
Yeah, I think that's hugely important, especially too for parents who don't necessarily like. Our kids are not speaking Farsi, right? Like the boys are not speaking Farsi, and obviously their parents have learned English, but there's always that slip. I mean, I grew up in a home with a bilingual parent and also a parent who was very monolingual. And, I've got cousins who are trilingual. I've got, and I mean, baby cousins who are like trilingual, and it's great to see, right? It's so exciting. And you just kind of got to keep up with the tiny people, right? But I think there's something about growing up in translation, right? Like, no matter what you know about your environment and how you move in that environment or how you interact with people outside of your home, like, there's this fundamental act of living in translation. And I do believe it's an action, right? Like living in translation, like you've got one foot in one place, one foot in another. And it changes the way you see language. It changes the way you see the evolution of language. It changes the way you see access to language. Yeah, I know how to diagram a sentence, but do I need to do it on a regular basis? I do not. I'm good. Thanks. Do I know someone with a really cool tattoo of a diagram sentence on his yes, I do. That's not me. I'm good. Thanks. I'm glad I learned how to do it. But, I do think grammar is something that can be sort of used as a cudgel. And if we're not teaching kids to interact with words and language in a way that resonates with them, then what are we doing? We're not walking around sounding like pilgrims, right? Like we shouldn't be, at least. And I think it's kind of great to know that your novel is grounded in 12 and 13-year-olds who are like, well, let me explain to you what my world looks like, because I think you're full of it. And when you look at like the explosion of YA literature, what's happening in middle grade readers and all of that kind of stuff, it's like, well, if you're going to build a new generation of readers, you can't all give them Thoreau and Wadsworth and be like, oh, here's Thanatopsis, go to town, tiny person.
That's the thing. Yeah. And I'm really, this is like, a very kind of idealistic dream of mine. But when I imagine, you know, my students from Pacoima or students across Los Angeles,
right.
You know, if they come across this book, what I didn't want to happen is to have a novel that deals with themes and experiences that they are dealing with on an everyday basis, but it's locked in a syntax that is unavailable to them. Yeah. Now, if they want to grow up and study and as you said, diagram sentences and read, amazing. I love that shit too. However, in the meantime, as like a vehicle to get there, I wanted them to be like, yeah, you can hear yourself in this and that, and perhaps, I mean, that's what, as we talked about, We the Animals, like the rhythm of those sentences.
Oh, those boys.
I was like, oh, you're allowed, you can do that. And it's like, that was a vehicle for me. Like that book was like a Bible for me during when I was living in New York. And so in a way, I wanted, even if kiddos don't go on to become writers, I think to be able to see themselves, it's like what you point out to Javier's quote. Yeah, to be able to see themselves reflected, I think is so important.
It so matters. I mean, Caleb Azuma Nelson has said this too about Zadie Smith's NW. Is like, that's the book that said, now he grew up in a different part of London, but he was just like, oh no, I can do this. And I love the idea that some kid is going to pick up your novel and just be like, oh, I recognize this.
I open my door, they're in the same apartment complex. They're probably still hanging on the staircase there.
I mean, all of that basketball. At one point too, I mean, it felt like you were sort of referencing Kwame Alexander's middle grade books. There's a moment where one of the brothers passes another book, and I'm like, oh, could be. Or maybe it's just totally made up, but whatever. But the idea that the boys are connecting, not just physically, right? Not just through basketball, not just through riding their bikes, not just through, you know, their parental situation, because they're trying to figure out their parents as well. But the idea that they're sort of passing books. I mean, at one point, Siddhartha makes an appearance.
That killed me.
Does everyone, I mean, seriously, it's like Siddhartha, the Basketball Diaries. Like there's always something where you're like, oh yeah, okay. It's a rite of passage. No, seriously, there are certain books, right? There's certain books when you read them when you're like 18 years old and it's like, that's the best thing you've ever read in your life. And then you go back later and you're like, oh, apparently I knew nothing when I was 18. Nothing. And you just kind of, your eyes get really big. Like, oh, that was a poor choice. But hey, now I know better. And I mean, I love the idea that our reading tastes and our habits and all of this can evolve, right? Like, who's speaking to us and how? And
well, it's so like with that example, I think to me, it's, you know, you can fill in the blank with any title. I think particularly what you mentioned about Siddhartha and with Justice, I think the fact that there is a book that he turns to that sort of, and again, I don't want to give too much away about his character, but that just, I'll say, like, diverts his attention to something a little less harmful and something to kind of hone him in. I think as Kay, seeing that there's an admiration where he's like, you found something. Like, I need to find something now.
Yeah. And that is, again, I know I said this earlier in the show, but there is a book for everyone. Right. Like it may not be the same thing, but everyone should just go read Christina Sharp's Ordinary Notes. But that's an aside. That's just, everyone should just go, everyone should read that. And everyone should read I Will Greet the Sun Again. But at the same time, like I genuinely believe that if you can just keep an open mind and keep an open heart, there will be a book that you'll connect with. And it might not be the one that you're expecting. And that's part of what I love. I mean, I came to Los Angeles, much like you grew up there. I did not. And it is a huge piece of my world and has been for, you know, a couple of decades at this point, more than a couple.
Wow.
But like my life in LA, I recognize parts of it in this novel. And, you know, I have nothing to do with these children. Nothing to do, you know, it's just, but there's this sense of LA that just pervades this book in a way.
Have you ever come across the LA River, Miwa?
Yes, I have. I've even taken the subway to do it. So
wow.
Yeah, I do take the subway when I'm, you know, I'm apparently the only person who does, but I really like it and it's very useful.
The red line, so. Yeah.
I am yes, absolutely. But you know, now there's a stop in Little Tokyo, which People are trying to call the arts district. I'm like, yeah, it's Little Tokyo, but that's okay. Like, are we really doing? Oh, we are really doing this. Okay. Yeah. Gentrification has come for like the last little bits.
Especially that corner, Miwa, because it's like high rise, new high rise, $6,000 apartment. You know,
I was at dinner on San Mateo Street the other day, and I was just like, wait a minute, what is that building? That was not there. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a shell of a new high rise with, you know, all of this. And I'm like, that was not there 3 months ago. I don't really understand how quickly that building went up. And I'm like, don't we have earthquake stuff that apparently, okay. I don't build buildings. I just sell books.
But I mentioned because in the boys, you know, it's called The Wash. And I just remember being so confused as to why it was called a river, and it's like, you know, it's far from what a river in, let's say, in the East Coast or other parts of the country look like. And that was just like another, I guess, in a way, I spent a lot of times at the Wash or near the LA River, and it was kind of a homage to what that strange structure meant to me growing up.
But again, the landscape, right? Mm-hmm. Like the landscape is so much a part of this book. And you do it. The way you write about the Valley, the way you write about LA, the way you write about these boys, it's all very economical. You are not wasting words. So this brings me back to the language thing. So you've talked about how autobiographical this is. You've worked on it. You did sort of need a little bit of outside push, right, to say, I can do this as a novel and not as nonfiction. So when do you know it's time to let it go? Like at one point you had to hand it over to your agent, and then you had to hand it over to your editor. And now you're handing it over to readers.
You want to hear something crazy? Well, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, but this is the most kind of honest answer. With this book, my problem was actually sitting with it longer. You know, where my agent or my editor would be like, it's not, you know, we need this. It's not. I'm like, but like he and Johnny, they did it. They did the thing. Like we're ready to fly. And they're like, no, there's this thing. So I'm sure you know, my experience with further books will be different, where I will do that thing where I just keep working on it, and Lord knows there was a lot of revision that went into this book, but the child in me was just like, we're done. We could be done. Like we wrote about something that other people that I haven't read before. So isn't it great? Like, doesn't it need to be published next week? You know, they're like, no, honey.
Yeah, my God. Process. Yeah, no, rewriting. I can't say this enough, but rewriting is a big part of the process. You got to take out the stuff that, and you got to add in.
And there was a lot of with my editor. Like, let's just say she saved me from myself in a lot of instances.
You have a very good editor, I will say that. I'm very fond of her taste. She's got really good taste. Do you miss this family? Do you miss Kay?
There will be these times, Miwa, where I'm like here washing dishes or whatever, and the people that I miss are. Because what you said earlier about like not just the brothers, but like the Johnnies, the Kays, the Christians, the people that they encounter on the basketball court, you know, in the neighborhood. I miss what it meant to be a child and not quite have the language to understand how fraught things were. I mean, of course, they were going through these things, but it was just so propulsive and every day. And there was, for me, such a sense of community, and I miss that gathering of being able to come together. And even if you're not talking about it specifically, there's, you mentioned, you know, there's a great deal of basketball. And there's one scene in particular with Kay and Sean, his eldest brother, where it turns quite violent. And for me, obviously, I don't hope that for any siblings or anybody, but I think there was a kind of grace and the opportunity that basketball afforded for physicality, for even like, just this primal reaction, which allowed them actually to have some semblance of a relationship.
To me, that was a conversation. I mean, yes. It reads like, okay, here's the thing. It reads like a fight. Absolutely. It reads like a fight. It reads like two brothers knocking each other around. But for them in that moment, it's a conversation. It's the only way they have to connect. I am not excusing violence. I am not saying that this is, we should always use our words. Yes, absolutely. But in this particular case, in this novel, in this world with these brothers, that was it. That's all they had. That was the only way they were going to connect. And later, yes, they find their words. They turn into adult men together. Like this is a moment with little boys being little boys. And yet, I mean, they're adolescents at this point, but I'm sorry, adolescents are not, they're little boys.
A lot of adult men are still little boys.
Yeah, so. Well, and that's, yeah, you don't let the toxic masculinity slide in this book. You do not. You're just like, and you, and you, and you, and you. Which I will say, as a chick, it was very nice to see the men calling out the men. Like, we can't always be the ones going, oh, this again. Right, sometimes it helps when the men are like, oh, this again. And, you hope that the boys will figure it out. And I think they might. I mean, I'm assuming that as much as you and I have joked about whether or not you come back to these characters in another book, that you've started the next thing, right? Like you're thinking about what the next thing might be. Yeah.
Pretty deep into it, Miwa. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Haven't shown it to anybody, and I'm like, as far as like agent editor, and I'm so curious, like if they'll just be like, no, thank you. We'll see. But I'm talk about. I'm like, I'm working really hard on this.
Oh, next that game. I don't doubt. I mean, that's okay. That's you're like, I'm just like you're doing the work. I'm just waiting to read. I just have to read. Like really. I just have to wait. I can do the patience thing when it comes to writers, but other than that, I'm kind of like, hi, patience, what is that? I'm not good at standing on. I'm really not good at standing.
But what you give us with this show, I've told you just before we start recording, like a Tessa Mush, all of them. I just sit there and I'm like, cool, I get a free education, free. But like, you know what I mean? It's just so thank you. And you work exceptionally hard as well. And we're so lucky. I really mean that. We're so lucky to have you in this program.
Well, that's insanely nice of you to say, but thank you. Because, it does take a lot of time, but it's worth it. It's totally worth it. I mean, the most important piece for me, though, is that, like, this is an LA novel. There's so many people who have ideas about what it means to be from Los Angeles, and who we are and all this other stuff. And it's just like, well, actually.
Well, thank you so much for like driving that, because it's like it's equal to like what you're saying, where we're talking about like coming through customs and getting all kinds of stares and looks and questions, and then us being like, yo, we're American, like get over it, blah blah blah. And I need to sort of embrace what you're saying, which is like I think hearing you say is the first time I have sort of recognized in myself and acknowledged that this is an LA novel. But for me, because it's, I think, different from the Los Angeles media that I take in, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a space under that umbrella. So I just really appreciate you like really driving that home, because
it is.
I love Los Angeles, and to be able to write about it, it's
Khashayar Khabushani, dude, let's do this again. I cannot wait for the next book. I cannot wait for the world to experience your LA novel. It makes me so happy that this book is going to be out in the world. So I will greet the sun again. And yes, I had to look at the title because I do not want to mess up this title. And I have a horrible tendency of shortening titles. Anyone knows this. So anyway, dude, it was so good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us on Port Over.
Appreciate you very, very much, Miwa.
I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I have been waiting to talk to Jamel Brinkley about his new story collection, Witness. You remember A Lucky Man? It was a finalist for the National Book Award. It also won the Ernest Gaines Prize, which if you follow that prize, our friend Mr. Brinkley here is in very good company, and we're very excited about this. But, Jamel, I wanted to talk to you because you've done 2 story collections back to back. And you and I have both been in and around books for a really long time. And there's this constant sort of nagging that, oh no, story collections are hard. Short stories are dead. This is your art form. This is your thing. You're not writing now. And maybe you do have a novel planned at some point, but these are spectacular story collections. So why? Why stories?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Miwa. Thank you for having me on, first of all. I'm excited to talk to you. Why stories? I mean, first of all, I guess I should just say that I totally share your frustration about the way that short stories are talked about. You know, like sometimes I'll make the grave error of going over to Goodreads.
Dude.
And I know, not to my own stuff, but just to see what people are saying. I almost never look at my own Goodreads review. But even there, you'll have readers say things, and it frustrates me to no end. You'll have readers say things along the lines of, I don't really like short story collections, and this book is a short story collection, so I didn't like it. I mean, that's basically the gist.
Yeah, no, yeah.
It's crazy. So for whatever reason, either, because of reader response, either because of publishing and sales and all that stuff, either because the novel, just has more cachet and is sort of seen as the real form. Short stories, yeah, they don't get valued as much as they should, and they're incredible. It's just a incredible form. It's its own form. It has its own integrity. It's not the thing you do before you write a novel. It's not a preparation for something else that's real. They are real. And I write them because technically they're so challenging. They're incredibly difficult. Novels are difficult too, of course, but short stories are difficult. You have to, the amount of work that you have to do in such a limited space to write a good short story. I think if people really thought about that, then maybe they would respect the form more. And so I love that challenge. I love the challenge of getting a glimpse and the suggestion of an entire life or an entire group of lives in the space of 6,000 words.
Part of it is too, you're covering so much interiority and you're covering time. And I think it's really easy for folks to not think about how time plays out on the page, right? Like if you're watching something on a screen, whether it's big screen, little screen, whatever, you're watching something on a screen, time moves in its own sort of fashion. But like you can cover, if you need to, you can cover mere minutes in a short story, or you could do a decade. You could do more. It's just how you control the words on the page. And you like to go a little, technically you go a little long for stories, right? Like you do go a little long, which is kind of the fun of it.
Yeah.
And it does. I went back and I reread a bunch of Lucky Man when I was prepping for this. And I have to tell you, like, haunting is a fair description, I think, for both titles and for both sets of stories. And okay, we are going to get, the story I'm talking about.
Yes.
we are going back to that family in Westchester, but haunting to me is kind of consistently more about what you've done in both books. And when I look back at how we were talking about A Lucky Man, masculinity was sort of the first thing. And I'm like, well, actually, yes, it is a big part of it. And it is exciting. And we are going to get to that. But you're playing with time. You're playing with isolation, right? Like you could argue it's loneliness, and you might argue it's loneliness, but you put your characters into these very tight spaces, and then you make them move.
Yeah.
Except it's not necessarily physical movement, right? Like you make them move and you really push them. And I'm wondering where you start. I mean, are we starting at the sentence level? Are we starting with language? Are we starting with character? Are we starting with place? Like, it doesn't feel like you're starting with, hey, I'm going to explore masculinity in the story. I'm sorry. I don't mean to laugh about it, but you understand why I'm kind of making fun of all of those pronouncements of this is what this is about. And I'm like, well, actually, I just really want to hang out with these characters, and they're leaving me a little bereft sometimes. Yeah. Like Simone, man, I'm not going to shake Simone for a really long time. And she's she's an early story in Witness. She's stuck somewhere here in the back of my brain for a really long time. But where does it start?
For me, a story can start, the seed of a story can be a lot of things. It can be an image, it can be a place, voice. It's never an idea, it's never a concept. It's something very small and specific and tangible. And if it's not already a place, then I quickly start to think about place. You talked about the characters being in these small spaces, and I often think about stories in terms of containers. What's the container for the movement of a story?
Okay.
You know, because once you have the container, then it actually is liberating. You know, the constraint is what frees the story to move. And so, yeah, you could have a character physically not move from a space or move, have very limited movement, but the story can range because you have a starting place, you have a foundation, you have something that's stable and sturdy where a story can go. So I would say place. If it's not immediately place, then I go to place. I look for place. What's going to continue this story?
Is place a character?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I mean, I say that having grown up in New England, which, you know, has all of the baggage that comes with it. But it's like, you know when you're in the woods of New England, right? Like it's... And you grew up in the South Bronx and you grew up in Brooklyn. And I just really want to be clear that you're not writing autofiction.
Yeah.
And I think there are times where, especially with a collection like this, or both of these collections, where, you know, folks want to bring their own experience, but they also expect that they are getting more from an author, more of the author's. You're in a way breaking your own privacy, I think is what I'm trying to say, that you're putting even more on the page. And I find that kind of fascinating. It's like people get really attached to the idea of the author and their background and what's happening on the page. And I just, would you take a second and talk about the Brooklyn and the South Bronx that you grew up in? Because you haven't been back for a minute, but
yeah,
like, I want to set that stage because I do think that landscape is pretty important.
Yes. So for me, my Brooklyn and the Bronx kind of spans from the 80s to the early 2000s.
Okay.
I left New York, well, a little later than the early 2000s. I left New York in 2013. That's where my memories are, from my earliest memories to my most formative experiences.
Right.
That's the New York that's closest to my heart. Yeah. That's the New York that I'm kind of comparing New York to every time I return and visit and see the strange towers that have popped up everywhere, you know? So that's my New York.
Yep. And part of why I asked, though, like New York in the 80s, right, versus New York in the 90s, such a radical change from 80s New York to 90s New York. And then you jump like the early aughts, I don't quite know how to describe them, but now, you know, the difference between 1990 and, you know, 2010, it's like a lifetime. And it's not just the buildings. It's, you know, we've lost bodegas. We've got banks on every corner. Now the banks are moving out and the drugstores are like, yeah, we're a little over this. I mean, we have a lot of empty storefronts. But it hasn't gone back to what it was, right? Like, I mean, it was a very different place, even through the 90s, right?
I know.
Like, I get kind of excited thinking about that old, like we're all sort of attached to have you ever read The Colossus of New York?
Yes.
Okay. So, you know, the Colson Whitehead book about New York, we get attached to our pieces of New York, but those pieces of New York have also formed your characters.
Totally. Yeah.
Like when I think of that story, Clifton's, do I have the top? Yeah. Clifton's Place.
Yeah.
From Lucky Man. Like that to me is about a time and a place and people. And I really kind of wanted to dissect that story with you because not a lot of people talk about it. And it seems like everyone's got their favorites. And I'm like, that story breaks my heart when I think about it. I mean, I love Sadie. I love Ellis.
I know.
But I'd like you to set it up, if you would, please. And then we can sort of work backwards from there.
Yeah. So Clifton's Place was sort of inspired by, there were a few bars in Brooklyn, which is Brooklyn places, you know? And it just sort of felt like they would always be there. Like you can't have Brooklyn without these places. So I'm thinking of like Frank's, for instance, near Fort Greene.
Yes, I remember Frank's.
Or the Tip Top Bar. The Tip Top.
That one I didn't know. Yeah, that one I didn't know. But.
So this bar, Clifton's, actually physically resembles the Tip Top Bar more than anything else. And what was sort of gorgeous about these places that you would just get like the locals, like the regular people who would just frequent it. You know, just these gathering places for people who felt like they have sort of Brooklyn is etched onto their skin, you know? And so the story starts off with kind of like, it's almost like a very slow pan of the camera.
Yeah.
For this place, kind of like really getting a look at it, you know. And then we kind of focus in on Ellis, our main character. And then the story proper begins. But the name of Clifton's was given by the person who runs it, Sadie, named after an old lover. And basically what happens in the story is there's an enactment of gentrification happening. New people are frequenting the place, engaging with it in ways that people have never engaged with the space, you know. And Ellis, who is, you know, one of those solitary figures you were alluding to earlier, a lonely kind of guy, he's there. And Sadie, who's sort of, I won't say she's losing her mind. I had a friend who loses their mind, but you know, she's an older woman. But Ellis sort of takes on the role of this former lover, you know, as an act of kindness, but also as a way to address his own loneliness. So it's this sort of complicated move when he sort of agrees to step into this guy Clifton's shoes.
That story for me, and yeah, it is the last story in Lucky Man, but that story for me set the stage for Witness and what you're doing and the loneliness that runs through Witness. And I want to talk about the title for a second, because I think it's really important. I mean, Lucky Man, there is that titular story. And sometimes I don't know how I feel about Lincoln.
That's good. That's how you should feel.
Sometimes I don't know how I feel about Lincoln. I do think his wife has a leg to stand on.
Oh, I agree with you. I totally agree with you.
But I really, Clifton's Place does sort of set up this new collection. And can we talk about the title for a second before, because obviously there's also a titular story, Witness, but I just want to talk about the title for the collection itself and this, what we're witnessing, because I don't think it's as simple.
Yeah, it's not simple. I hope it's working on multiple levels.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I'll just say that. Yeah. Yes.
The seed of the idea of using Witness, you know, James Baldwin, one of my favorite writers, is always talking about witnessing. It's one of his key words, you know. And one of the epigraphs for the book is taken from I Am Not Your Negro, in which Baldwin says, you know, the line between a witness and an actor is thin, but, you know, but there is a line, right? He's basically saying that it's a thin line, but the line exists. And I love that idea. Elsewhere in an essay called This Nettle Danger, at the very beginning of this essay, he's talking about how rare it is to find a writer who is a true witness to his experience. Mm-hmm. Because being a true witness to your experience means you're sort of shed of all your illusions, and you can't live on the surface of things anymore. You have to sink into the depths. And so in this book, I think I'm exploring a collection of related questions. One is, what's the difference between being a witness to what you want to see and being a witness to what you need to see? Mm-hmm. Being pushed out of your own limited perception into seeing what you really need to see as a person. And then secondary to that is, once you see what you need to see, what are you going to do? Mm-hmm. You're going to act. Are you going to act responsibly? Right? And the third level, I think, and you know, some of the other epigraphs kind of move in this direction. It's not just what you perceive in a way that's external to yourself and what you do out in the world. Mm-hmm. It's also perceiving yourself. It's also being a witness to your own self, to your own actions. And so I think the collection is kind of looking at that cluster of questions and exploring them.
Comfort is the story I was referring to when I was talking about Simone. The isolation, it's not the first story in the collection, but it is early in the collection. And her isolation and what she is unable to witness in her own life is really painful. It's really painful, and it's really uncomfortable, and it's hard. And I need to know where this story came from, because it is slightly a sibling to Clifton's Place, right? In terms of what the characters are experiencing in terms of loss and broken community, I think. Because I don't really, you know what I'm trying to dance around, obviously. Yeah. But this broken community and this idea that we get to a point where we can't necessarily participate in our own lives. And I sort of want to walk through the creation of that story because I really, I'm not going to shake this woman for a while. I'm really not.
Yeah, I absolutely see that connection to Clifton's place that you're talking about. That feels real to me. Another story that I was thinking about is a story by William Trevor.
Yeah.
Titled A Day. In that story, the container is, again, it's largely a domestic story, not exclusively, but it covers a day. It's hours in the experience of a woman. And the thing that's haunting her, you find out pretty early on in the story, so this isn't a spoiler, but the thing that's haunting her is infidelity. I love that something seems like it shouldn't work. It seems like the story should not work.
I feel that way about a lot of William Trevor stories, though, because I'm like, how does this dude do this? Because seriously, these tiny, tiny domestic setups, right? And I'm not necessarily interested in other people's domestic squabbling, but at the same time, I totally am, because that's where the truth of the thing is, right? You're hiding a really big political statement in a tiny domestic moment, like a dish breaks. Yes. Or my husband's a cad, or, you're just out of prison and you're trying to figure out how to connect with someone who's not sure she wants to connect with you. And yet, I get the Trevor thing. I really get the Trevor thing. But at the same time, I'm like, how do these stories work? I'm not entirely sure. Yeah.
And so with comfort, I was thinking about I wanted to focus in on the aftermath of a terrible occurrence. I wanted to write about that kind of terrible occurrence, but not censor that occurrence. I wanted to censor the people. I wanted to censor a specific person, this woman, who is dealing with what has happened. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned before, I needed that container, and I felt like I could use this container of the day. And so I really wanted to press myself very close to her experience, almost her minute by minute experience in a way, and explore the way that time, against her will, almost kind of dilates and causes her more pain. But also the ways that she tries to cope, the ways that she tries to live her life, the ways that she still tries to experience pleasure or joy in her life, which may not always be the healthiest ways. And so I really wanted to write a story that looked very closely at this kind of pain and grief. And it was difficult to write, actually. It was slow. It was very slow writing. I felt like I could endure it bit by bit, and then I had to step away from it to try to see it clearly. But that's where it came from.
I mean, part of the thing about short stories, too, is, right, you're capturing that hinge moment where before tips into after. Yeah. Except what you're doing with time, when you said dilation, I was like, yeah, that actually is the perfect word. Because, you've compressed her day, but it doesn't mean you're not playing with time in this story. Right. Because when you drop a line in there, and the first time I saw it, it was an amount of time between what happens and where we are. And I was like, my eyes got really big. And actually my eyes will continue to get really big when I think about it, because it's a nifty trick. Mm-hmm. And it's not performative. It makes perfect sense in the context of what's going on, and yet at the same time it's a serious wow moment, and there are probably people listening going, what are you talking about? But you just have to read the story, and that's that before and after, right? You do that in ways that there are a couple of times where I was like, he's gonna zig and use it, which I love. And it's harder to do in a story because you don't have any padding. No. Right? You actually have to do some stuff in 3 sentences because you just don't have the room. Yeah. But the new collection, Witness, do you have a favorite story?
Do I have a favorite? I have favorite stories for different reasons. There are things that please me about a few different stories.
Okay.
So being able to sort of capture the feeling of grief without the story becoming stagnant is something that I like about Comfort, for instance.
Yeah.
Other stories I like because of the way that I'm peeling away at the narrator and exposing the narrator over the course of a story, or the way that a narrator who is really reticent will kind of blossom certain moments of a story. I think those are things that I love too. I don't know. There are a few of them I really have a lot of affection for.
When we meet the woman who is in the let out, there's a woman talking to a young man at a museum. The way that story unfurls, I was hoping she was going to turn out to be who she was, and you did not disappoint. I was like, oh, please, this would be such an excellent setup. Please, as I'm watching this kid puzzle it out. Yeah. But for you as a writer, when you're puzzling this stuff out, right, you're not sitting down and saying, this is where the story goes. No. My understanding is that you sit and you noodle and you riff, and then finally, a couple of drafts in, couple, 3, 4, I don't know how many drafts, you finally get the thing, right?
Yeah, that's right. There are a lot of wrong turns, which are functional wrong turns. They're the kinds of wrong turns that it's part of the experimentation process. Just retrace your steps and go back. You find the story again, you keep going, and you find the right way. I like that feeling of discovering it. One reason I like that story is because it captures a certain feeling that I had. Nothing like that ever happened to me, speaking of but, so that story is based on First Saturdays at the Brooklyn Museum.
Yeah, I figured.
And there was a feeling that I had there when I would go where any kind of encounter could happen. What did happen is that I would see people I hadn't seen in years. You would just sort of bump into someone, like an old friend, I hadn't seen you in 2 years or something. It would just be this rediscovery of someone in your life. And I was like, yeah, that's the kind of place that this is. And again, thinking of place and what places can do, it's like, a call goes out and people show up by the hundreds and thousands. Anything could happen. And that's sort of the pleasure of a place like that for a story, because any kind of encounter can occur.
Do you surprise yourself?
Yes.
While you're working? Okay.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
In fact, one of my great pleasures in writing short stories is the surprise of an ending. I love when you can see an ending like shortly before it happened, shortly before you set it on the page. That's my favorite feeling. You're like, this is where this story is going to land, needs to land, must land. Did not know that 5 minutes ago. I certainly didn't know it when I started this draft. Now I know it. And that surprise is the absolute best feeling, because it feels like all the forces, all those wrong turns, that careful kind of tracking of the story, like, it's like a bloodhound just after it, has come to fruition, and you found this ending, and it's just a wonderful feeling.
There is sort of an intimacy and a longing to a lot of your characters, and it's not just the isolation, right? Where do you come on the side of isolation versus loneliness? Like, I sort of feel like they're very separate entities. There are other people who would argue, well, they're two sides of the same coin. I mean, where do you come down on that?
I think they're on a spectrum.
Okay.
And I think that I think my characters can sort of end up anywhere on that spectrum. Yeah. Sometimes within the space of the same story, they might be in one place and then sort of tilt the other direction. I think it's perfectly possible to be in solitude and not be lonely.
Right. I mean, because that's part of it. And I also think that sometimes characters who are isolated or characters who are lonely don't necessarily know that they're isolated, because they keep throwing themselves into like piles of people. And it's like, well, actually, you're just not connecting.
It's true.
Right. And I understand what you're saying when you say they're on a spectrum, but that's partially why it feels so separate to me, and that we conflate it just kind of as an easy shorthand. Yeah. And the way you chip away at your sentences, like, I'm guessing there's a lot of rewriting.
There's a lot of rewriting
that goes in to what you do, right? That the rewriting is part of the process.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I write slow, messy first drafts.
Okay.
Weird. They're messy, but they're not fast.
Yeah. No, I get it.
They're sort of all over the place. They're a little loose, especially for short stories. Some of my favorite short story writers write some of those longer, more digressive, discursive stories. Like
you mean Alice Munro? You mean Edward P. Jones?
Yeah, those are my faves.
Some of the masters, but Munro, again, like talk about taking tiny, tiny details. And I'm like, I will follow you anywhere. Yeah. I will absolutely follow you anywhere. And in a novel, I might not be willing. There are times where I look at things and say, you could have been shorter. I can see the Trevor. I can see the Munro. I can certainly see the Jones. And you've also talked about Yi-Yun Lee and her influence on her work. And I think she's a rock star. I just think she does amazing, amazing stuff. So in terms of influences, though, I mean, yeah, we're talking about story writers, but who are some of the other writers that you see flip? I mean, obviously, you've talked about Baldwin as well. I mean, those feel like the biggies, but they can't be the only influences. I mean, you do have an MFA from Iowa.
Yeah. Some of my other influences, I think, I don't know if it's directly on the page, but in terms of the way that I think about writing, Marilyn Robinson is a big influence. She was one of my teachers at Iowa. Charles D'Ambrosio is a big influence in the way that I think about writing. Gina Barrio is a writer that I love. I think an underread short story writer, like really kind of a brilliant short story writer. So I think she's pretty important to my work as well.
When you say they changed the way you think about writing, what's an example?
I had a class with Yi-Yun Lee before I started as a student at Iowa. The thing that was great about that is that she sort of prepared you to challenge any orthodoxy about writing. Yeah. The idea that you can't switch point of views. Point of view violation is, a problem automatically if you change point of view. Or the idea of show don't tell, for instance. Is something that she goes at too. And it was a really great preparation going in, because to the extent that an MFA program might train you in certain ways to write, I think I came in ready to be like, the possibilities of writing are endless. You don't have to do it that way. And I sort of feel like Marilyn Robinson was the same way. The workshop was pretty unique in the sense that I remember one week, actually, she sort of forbade us to use certain craft terms. Because she said
Marilyn Robinson. Okay.
Yeah. They don't use those words. I think someone said suspense or something along those lines. And she piped up out of nowhere and said, don't use that word. Like it was a curse word or something. Okay. And we all kind of looked at her, because she usually waited to speak until, the end of someone's workshop. And we kind of looked. And then she gave us this whole list of words that she thought were absolutely useless in terms of writing. And for her, it's about the quality of attention. The quality of attention is what matters. The quality of your attention. Where your stories fail, it's because that quality of attention has eroded. Where your story fails, it's because you don't have respect for your characters. All your characters, she insisted, not just your main character. She told us to be on the side of all the characters in your work. That's the immense challenge of writing.
That's something that pops for all of your stories. Even the toddlers, even like the little boys in the swimming pool story.
Yeah.
The camp story in Lucky Man, but like some of Lincoln's colleagues, like people that wouldn't necessarily, and certainly like Clifton's Place, like the background players, you flip it.
Yeah.
And I love that. And the way that you bring people to the fore who might not otherwise get their stories told, right? Like Blessed Deliverance, right? The kids in that story. Yeah. Oh, man. That's a way to talk about gentrification.
Yes.
Yeah. And then here's the thing, like you are talking about carceral systems and gentrification and theft, like deed theft and all of these big things. But you never lose sight of the people.
Yeah.
And then you throw a ghost story in the middle of it.
Yeah.
You're playing with genre. That I was not expecting. I was just like, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got to talk about the ghost story for a second, because I mean, essentially it is a family story.
Yeah.
And at first I was kind of like, oh, we're going here.
Yeah.
But you're playing with genre and you're giving this framework that I would think of when I think of you, right? On the page is a family story, and a family's going to go awry and they think they're holding on, and yet, but even the toddler has a present. The ghost has a present, like all of it.
Yeah.
So how did we get there with that story? Like, why the ghost story? And yes, I realize why not could be a perfectly acceptable answer, but I'm asking more about that story because it is a surprise. It's a surprise.
Yeah.
Like, sorry, you and ghost stories? What?
I know. You know what's funny is that's actually the oldest story in the collection. The first draft of that story was written 10 years ago and wasn't working. So I put it aside.
Okay. All right.
It was just out of sight, out of mind for years.
Okay.
And as I was working on this collection, and I started to sort of see what the collection could be, I thought, you know what? Let me take a look at that old story that wasn't quite working. I revised it, and it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Why a ghost story? There are a few things that have been kind of really on my mind for a while now. I'm fascinated by ghosts, and I'm fascinated by hauntings. When I was a graduate student at Columbia before going to Iowa, I remember reading this academic book that I thought, first of all, was beautifully written, but also fascinating. It's called Ghostly Matters.
Okay.
E.G. Gordon. And in that book, she talks about ghosts as seething presences. That we're not talking about an absence exactly, but a charged space, a charged gap, and a kind of condensation of time. Mm-hmm. And I kind of love that as a way of describing what a ghost is or what a haunting is. You know, and she talks about slavery. She talks about the disappeared in South America, like different ways of talking about this. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And then, you know, like Saidiya Hartman's work, she talks about the afterlife of slavery, right? So I'm just thinking like, yeah, you know, these figures kind of fit exactly or fit well the way that I think about time. Mm-hmm. You know, that we don't have a discrete past, present, future, right? That you're always sort of entangled with time, sort of walking through these gossamer webs of time all the time. Yeah, you do some stuff in that story with grief and forgiveness. Forgiveness is hard, right? Like everyone seems to talk a big game about forgiveness, right? Like just forgive and you'll feel better. And it's like, well, it's not that simple. Like forgiveness is a complicated thing. And your characters know it without being able to speak about it. Yes. And that's like a high wire act. Like how in the world are you doing? And I suppose it's just a matter of you let your characters be your characters, but it's really impressive to see all of the silence on the page and all of the things that go unsaid, forgiveness or connection or what have you. And can we talk about the spaces and the emptiness and the stuff that you have to take out to let your characters do their thing? Because it's not just the ghost story. I mean, you see this in the titular story. You see this in Witness. You see this in what's the Happiest House? On Union Street. You leave a lot out. You leave a lot to the imagination in that story. And then when you fill in the gaps. I think it's part of the art, right? Especially with short stories. It's about figuring out what to leave in. And also, you know, for the production of story itself, it's often about removing things. It's about taking things away. Because sometimes those things are protective of the characters, or they act as buffers between the characters, right? They're the things you can leave in can sometimes keep the story civil and well behaved and not much happens, right? But when you start plucking things out, right, and then you sort of condense that space that you were talking about earlier, that's when things get cooking, right? So you have to have a sort of a good eye for what those things might be, what those protective buffering forces might be, and how the story might improve if you remove them. Right. What gaps did you? So, I mean, for instance, Happiest House on Union Street, like we don't get a lot of detail of what's gone down between the brothers. We just know
that there is discord, and there has been discord, and there will continue to be discord, and they're never going to track in the way that their mother would have liked, right? Or that the daughter/niece thinks. And I like having the details taken out, right? Like, I don't need to know this happened at this date and this time. Like, I need to know that there's friction, and I need you to let me puzzle out how I get to, like, Witness went in a couple of different directions where I was like, I was not expecting that. And I love that story. I love Bernice.
Yeah.
And talk about the stuff that does not get said between characters, even when Bernice's mom shows up and is being Bernice's mom. But like, I really love the stuff that gets left out. It's you do it in a family too, in Lucky Man. It really happens a lot.
Yeah.
A lot. I mean, talk about an aftermath story, right? And it's just like, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. But same thing, like, and it's not just the men who don't say things. Like, can I just be clear about this? Like, it's everyone, right? Bartow Station too.
Yeah.
Right. Like, it's not just our dude who's not talking. It is super not just him. And yes, he has the bigger story, but he's met with a lot of silence and a lot of difference, right?
Yes, it's true. Yeah. I think part of that is sort of seeing, like, there's something about the structure of the family that's often built on secrets and silences.
Yeah, right.
You know, and when the members of a family get together, those secrets and silences become so powerful. They become seething, like those seething silences that we were talking about. You know, and I've always been fascinated by that. You know, like, you get a sense that there's some history is in this room with us right now. No one's saying what it is, and I can barely detect it, but it is leaving its mark. It is radiating something, and I feel it. And so part of what I think I'm trying to do in these stories is to capture that, like that other character. Sometimes you can call it a ghost and give it a name, right? But sometimes it's not as easy as that. It's something a little more elusive. It's like, how do you capture that? Because I think it's so fundamental to groupings, you know, to have these sort of seething, strange, unsaid tensions, histories, secrets.
You mean like Bystander?
Yes.
I mean, you put your family in a tiny apartment. You've got a teenage girl who is really not in great shape. You've got mom who has been telling herself stories. And dad's kind of hanging out in the corner, just letting things unfold, when actually both his daughter and his wife need him to be a little more participatory. And he's really not in a place emotionally or intellectually where he's just like,
yeah.
And I mean, talk about the silences.
Yeah.
And the things that each of the characters wants the others to infer.
Yeah.
From those silences. It takes a lot to represent that in a sentence. Like, again, if you're watching it on a screen, you can physically make the silence happen, right? And you don't quite have the luxury of that shorthand.
Yeah. Oh, it's so true about that family. That dad is so content to play his assigned role. He's like, I'm just going to be this. I'm just going to be useless dad.
Yeah. He's
try to say something every now and then that only touches the surface of what's going on in his family.
When do you know collection's done, though? When do you know that you have the pieces? Because, I mean, the flow in both of these collections, right? We've all encountered story collections where you're like, oh, I see where you were going, but could we move this? I realize the books are printed and they're out in the world, but could we move this story? Could this just flip, 3 stories down? Like, I like collections to have an arc as well. And I think that's really important. And sometimes you get a collection where you're like, okay, that's a choice. But when do you, as the artist, say, okay, I have to hand it over to my editor. Now I have to start doing a different kind of work.
Yeah, my guess is that it just differs from book to book. The process was entirely different in these 2 books. So Lucky Man was sort of carved out of a larger body of stories. Probably had 14 or 15 stories. We whittled it down to 9 that really spoke to each other. the 9 that seemed like they had some sort of arc. Then, but once you do that, then you're getting into questions of sequencing, order, how one story prepares you for the next story, where a collection begins and ends. For instance, I love that the first story in that collection begins with sort of a youthful experience of music. And we have sort of this mournful or complicated, more mature music that's going on at the very end of the collection. So those are the kinds of talking across that I like. With this one, I was building up to the collection. So there are no secret stories out there hidden. And I also had a sense of it as a collection sooner than I did with A Lucky Pen. But the same thing, though, once we have the stories, it's a matter of, well, what sets the tone? How do you want to open the collection? What's the first sound that you want a reader to hear when they read Blessed Deliverance?
Yeah.
And how does that story prepare you for what's going on in the book? How does, with the ghost story, I don't know if you would agree, but I think that I think the story prior to that, which is Comfort, is a slight preparation for the appearance of the ghost story. Mm-hmm. And so thinking about things like that, how the end of one story rubs against the beginning of another story. Mm-hmm. These preparations, these thinking of it as notes, thinking of these like smaller arcs within the larger arc of the book.
I'm just also thinking about how Bartow Station sits with Witness. Like that is a really powerful pairing. And I remember thinking, okay, I took a little break after Comfort, and by little break, just needed to walk around my kitchen for a second. And then I took another break after that particular Sunday, and I'm really glad I read Bartow and Witness in quick order. Like it all comes back to Haunting and not just the ghost story. It's like these characters, they each have a very specific story. Mm-hmm. They each have a very clear point of view. Mm-hmm. Right. And obviously you and I are dancing around story points like crazy people because it's just no fun to ruin a story for someone else, especially when you do stuff with language and character that you can't necessarily do with a novel. Like it really is a very different art form.
It is. It's an entirely different form. It is. Yeah.
So does this mean you stay with stories? Is this, where we are? Because I'm not complaining. Yeah. But I'm curious, like, how do you push yourself when you have a form you love and it works? How do you push yourself? How do you make the next thing that stops your heart cold, right? Which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing when you're reading.
Yeah. I think I'll always be writing stories. Even if I do a novel or something, I think it doesn't mean that I moved on from the story form.
Right.
I'll continue my engagement with it. Part of the fun of story collections, and we were just sort of talking about this, is that it's not just about getting the individual story right. For me, a collection is also not just a gathering of here are all the stories I wrote in the last 4 years or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right? So part of the art and part of the challenge and part of what keeps it interesting is that you have this body of work. You have your 8, 9, 10 stories. And you have to see if they fit, and you have to see how they fit. Mm-hmm. And you get to play with the order and see what story they're telling, what the arc of that story, that gathering of stories is. And that's always interesting. I think there are always these little challenges you can give yourself in writing story collections that sort of renew the excitement of the form for you. Yeah. Like one thing with this book that I'll mention really quickly is that, like I said, this is a collection that's about a lot of characters who maybe don't want to see things. And in some cases, maybe don't want to do anything either. Mm-hmm. Right? That's a huge storytelling challenge to write about characters who don't want to see and don't want to do. Right?
Yeah.
Because you have to write stories that are vivid and sharp. And how do you do that if your characters are willfully closing things off, right? And you also have to have stories that are dynamic, right? And how do you do that if your characters, in many cases, want to remain still? Mm-hmm. And so for me, a lot of what is interesting and challenging and fun about this collection is to take something that, maybe you're not, in a writing class, they might tell you you can't have passive characters, something like that.
Right.
Okay. I see why you say that, but actually I can think of lots of stories that have passive characters that are great. And I'm going to write a whole collection full of them. How about that? That's a fun challenge for me to take something that seems like such a rule that you cannot violate and absolutely violate it and find ways to make stories that are interesting about characters who are, because of circumstances or because of their own will, just kind of stuck.
So break the thing and rebuild it. Make a new thing.
Rebuild it. Yeah.
That seems like a really good place to end. So I'm going to say thank you, Jamel Brinkley. I knew we were going to run out of time, and we have run out of time. Witness is out now. If you haven't read Lucky Man, it's out in paperback, and you should check that out too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. This has been great.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.